Okay, does anyone remember where we left last? What is it that we were doing in our last class? And what are we supposed to start with today?
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Good afternoon, Ankit. Good to see you. I'm asking whether anyone remembers what were we talking about last time, and where are we supposed to begin today? Do you remember what course are we studying together?
Ma'am, actually, the last three classes I missed, so I couldn't also get to see the recordings.
Mhm.
But today we have to start with reproductive rights.
Yeah, today that's because the timetable says so. But we are supposed to still do a little bit of quiz on sexual harassment. Those of you who did attend those classes or have seen the videos, can you identify what are the two kinds of sexual harassment scenarios which have been included in the legislation? You remember quid pro quo and hostile environment?
Yes, a hostile environment, quid pro quo.
Hmm. What is hostile environment and what is quid pro quo sexual harassment?
Quid pro quo would be something like soliciting sexual favors for providing some sort of promotion, or hostile environment would be intimidating them to provide sexual favors in terms of making their working conditions severe and more difficult.
Mhm.
Those.
So, okay, let's do the quiz and see whether we have understood it clearly. So let me share the quiz. You can see this. Tell us what is true or false. If my intentions were good, for example, I meant to compliment someone on how great they looked, there is no way my conduct could violate the sexual harassment policy.
False.
Hmm?
False.
False? Why?
Because it's the act which is sufficient to establish sexual harassment.
Speak loudly, I can't hear.
Ma'am, it is the act which is sufficient to establish sexual harassment. Intentions are not considered. The act can be of.
Yeah, so it's not only the act, but how the act has been perceived by the other person. Not my intention, but how is the other person receiving it? Okay. If it cannot be sexual harassment if both parties are of the same gender.
Ma'am, false.
Because we do recognize same sex, opposite sex. Even though we say that in the legislation is not been included, but in the university, the UGC regulations, it is included.
Ma'am, but a woman can be the harasser according to the Sexual Harassment Act.
Yeah.
So, man versus
Woman to
man.
woman, you're saying, woman to woman.
Ma'am, woman to woman is possible, right? It is recognized. Because the woman is recognized as the aggrieved, and there was no restriction to who the respondent or the accused could be. There was no explicit mention of a him.
True. There's a bad drafting again, another example of bad drafting, but the legislation is not even title does not say it is only sexual harassment at workplace. It says sexual harassment of women at workplace. And when we look at the definition of sexual harassment itself, it's also ambiguous. When you look at IPC definition of sexual harassment and the legislation definition, the IPC definition is the punishable, is the offense. And in that also we found that some of the clauses were not clear whether it is who the harasser could be. In some cases it is said man, some cases it is silent. There is again very, very loose drafting in both the legislations, IPC as well as in the uh, Sexual Harassment Act. Okay, next one. Quid pro quo harassment occurs when a female boss tells dirty jokes to other women in the office.
And that's hostile environment.
It's what?
That would be hostile environment, not so it's
Not quid pro
false.
quo. I think I've gone back. Quid pro quo is this for that and consists of exchanging job benefits for sexual favors or threatening the job benefit, threatening to deny the job benefits if sexual favors are not given. In this one, it may be hostile, but it is not quid pro quo. If someone is offended by my behavior in the break room, they should take their break somewhere else or at another time. Since I'm not working while I'm on my break and I have a right to freedom of speech.
It's sufficient that the people are colleagues or it's at the place of of work. They can even be outside the job physical premises, but there's still a relation then.
Yeah, it is not your right to make discriminatory harassing comments in the workplace, even if you're on a break or at the break section. If most people find a comment amusing and inoffensive, then the one person who is offended does not have a right to complain about harassment.
False.
Harassment discrimination laws protect everyone in the workplace. Sexual harassment can only come from a boss or co-worker.
And that's false. You could be sent on a job as well.
It can be just anybody.
Yeah.
And if you look at the system, when we're talking about university, it may be just anybody on the road who is harassing a student. That's also part of the, if our student is harassed even by a stranger, third party, we still take cognizance of that. Sexual harassment is a criminal offense and not only a policy.
False. Section IPC section 354
तो false क्यों है? तो correct है ना?
is, oh हाँ, sorry.
True. As well as POCSO. Sexual harassment includes unwelcome sexual advances or romantic interest or other unwelcome conduct that may be verbal, visual, or physical.
Now it's true.
Touching the person is not necessary, merely conduct which is verbal, visual, or even physical. So it's not that it has to be physical for it to be sexual harassment. Sexual harassment involves offering job benefits in exchange for sexual favors, or alternatively threatening a person's job if they do not agree to the offer.
Ma'am, true.
We just said this was what the quid pro quo will be. It is unlawful to retaliate against someone who resists unwelcome behavior, files a complaint about harassment or perceived harassment, or participates in an investigation. Why is everyone silent?
Ma'am, retaliation could be of many forms. Like with the Priya Ramani MJ Akbar case, the retaliation was in the form of.
That's not retaliation. We can say that we can say that in a loose manner, but filing a court case is not retaliation. Retaliation will mean being offensive, being hitting that person, being violent. That will be retaliation, not court cases.
No, it would be unlawful to retaliate.
It will be?
It would be unlawful.
But true, no?
Yeah.
Cannot go and hit the other person के कैसे file कर दिया हमारे खिलाफ. Employees are subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination for engaging in unlawful harassment or discrimination.
And even beyond that, we could be.
Yeah, but this can also happen. No? This can also happen. If no touching occurs, an action does not constitute sexual harassment.
False.
Let's look at that. So the answer is here in if a husband laughs at dirty jokes, it cannot be considered sexual harassment. It's false. Sexual harassment is unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. Use of profane language is not sexual harassment.
False. False, ma'am. It can be.
Multiple choice. Can a consensual relationship turn into a sexual harassment claim? Not possible because it's consensual. B, it depends on whether the university has a sexual harassment policy. C, yes. D, all of the above.
Ma'am, what do you? I don't understand the question. Turn into a sexual harassment.
Out of this four, what is the answer? Can a consensual relationship turn into a sexual harassment claim?
It's consensual, so no. But if something
Can it
happens,
done?
then
Can it
yes,
yeah, something goes wrong in that.
then yes, it can.
So it's not that if you are no, there was consensual donor, therefore even if things go bad and you still continue, one person says, okay, I am out, I'm quit from this relationship. The other still continues to harass, stalk that person, it still will be sexual harassment.
So it can.
Yeah. Making sexual comments and allowing sexual jokes to be passed around on campus is called quid pro quo harassment, B, hostile environment harassment, C, an open environment to everyone, D, both A and B.
Hostile environment. Hostile environment harassment.
B. If you're a professor or manager and someone complains to you about sexual harassment, it is best to A, laugh about the incident and indicate they could be overreacting. B, downplay it. C, point out the policy and ask them to follow procedure. D, contact internal complaints committee immediately to conduct an investigation of the complaint.
D.
D. D.
D,
Last one.
you sure? But I don't think that's really the correct answer. Because the policy does say that she has to file a complaint. So actually, she is a more appropriate answer. Point out the policy and ask them to follow the procedure. Because there are many times students do come to us and they say that no, this all is happening, but I cannot ask the ICC to do the to conduct the investigation. It is the student who has to file the complaint, and then ICC will take cognizance. You can assist, you can encourage them to do that, but you cannot directly approach the internal complaint committee. This is the aggrieved party which has to go there and do it. If sexual harassment incident is brought to your attention and the individual doesn't want to do anything about the complaint, you must not move forward and hope the issue resolves. Explain that the civil rights law require you to investigate the complaint, file it away, keep it confidential between both of you.
D.
Hmm?
And if the individual doesn't want to do anything, then
And you can't do the investigation. Huh? Here we cannot. How to prevent is the big question. What do you think? What needs to be done to do this? That I had a small interview with the students here interviewed me to meet the new VC online because we couldn't meet physically. So they did ask me, ma'am, what should be done to prevent sexual harassment? I'm asking the same thing to you. What would you say? Are there more students than two? In addition to Soumya and Ankit, is anybody attending this class? Can see some more names: Ayushi, Amisha, Nidhi, Abhinandan. Not participating at all?
Ma'am, I'm here. I answered also during the quiz.
Okay, I did not realize who was answering because I was not on this screen, I was on another. So do you want to answer now? Any suggestions about how to prevent it?
Ma'am, the employees in a workplace, they have to respect each other's boundary and the level of comfortability that the other person might be having with him or her. And also whoever is the victim, they also need to have some kind of a courage for them to stand up and file complaints against the person, because if they do not consistently file complaints, then I think the other person gets encouraged to continue this kind of a behavior.
Yeah, Nidhi says that we should establish ICC. They're not there in every place. And as per the university regulation for the whole of the postgraduate, for the whole of the university, there's only one ICC. Every college is supposed to have its own, but the university has one. I think I would want to focus on the word prevention. So the moment we think about ICC, we are saying what should happen once the action of sexual harassment has happened. So then to prevent recurrence, ICC has a role. And what we are saying that if people do not complain, other people will get encouraged, and knowing that nothing will happen, they will continue to do so. So all that is focusing on after the occurrence to prevent recurrence. Saying that if action happens, what we're talking about is a deterrence theory. That if action is taken, then people will be deterred to do it again, or other people will be deterred. So not only this person will be deterred, but also other people will learn their lesson. The other aspect is preventing is before it has occurred. So that is where the role of the gender sensitization committee is. So we have two kinds of mechanisms under the legislation. One is the gender sensitization committee, which is to function creating awareness on sexual harassment and encouraging people to respect each other. But if an occurrence has happened, to prevent recurrence by the either by the same person or by others, then the role of the ICC comes in. That there has to be action following. You have to talk of prevention at both the levels to prevent people, to ensure that the environment becomes so friendly for women that they're able to come to workplace and they're not leaving their job because of that. The second one is that if it has happened, action has to happen. Then what kind of actions should happen? So when you say establishing ICC is one thing, but what kind of actions would you suggest should happen if a student, let's say in the law faculty, is found guilty of sexually harassing another class fellow? What would you expect the ICC to do? If you are the ICC, what will be the considerations which you will keep in mind to ensure, to kind of, before you pass an order? Because there's a listing of the orders, but the whole question is which order to pick up, what are the consequences of those orders? And also the whole question that when the ICC is happening, during the proceedings, should any action be taken, or should it be only after the conclusion? So we have said under the law that it should be both the offender and the identity of the offender accused as well as the complainant should be kept confidential. So then at that point of time when a complaint has been made, should the administrator, should the ICC do anything at that point of time?
And they can make sure that the two students don't have to forcefully interact. Maybe the sections could be changed if that's a possibility.
So in the context of law faculty, suppose there is a CLC student harassing another CLC student from different sections. Should they be transferred to another center? Who should be transferred?
The accused.
If it is the different section in CLC itself, why should the accused be moved?
Ma'am,
Because he's the one who is creating problems.
But does he not have a right to be presumed to be innocent till proved guilty?
But something has to be done.
Yeah, so tell me what to be done without violating the rights of people. Nobody is saying that no action should be done. But what action?
just a warning that that this person should not contact the complainant, and if he does approach during the period of investigation and while considering the complaint, then there will be some sort of penalty. Then he might be liable to some sort of punishment, which is
Mhm.
another factor. But that should be made sure that she is not harassed in the sense that he comes and intimidates her in that scenario. That opportunity should not be given to him, and he should be warned explicitly against it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, it's a little complicated because if they're in the same section, there will be essential interaction in the same classroom. So it may be that okay, you still don't talk to her, but the visual is still there. The different section, there are no combined classes, then you have to make sure that no, they are not coming at least even in the visual category. Sometimes we do say, okay, pendency also transfer, the boy will certainly object that no, I have a presumption of innocence. How can you just accept her word? So the whole point is that when we create an ICC and we have a chairwoman there, whether that person should have a bias saying that we start with believing the woman or should they start with being neutral parties? Whether the presumption is that the woman is telling the truth, but the boy can prove that no, she is not telling the truth. Or whether we start that no, the complainant has to prove her case, the prosecution has to prove their case. What are the standard of proof required? What are the procedure to be followed? All those details have to be worked out. It cannot be. But sometimes we do say that when, as a starting point, because there is a majority of women, they will start with an assumption of believing the woman. But that is something which is just a presumption, which is very rebuttable. A due process has to be followed. Before you take any action, a hearing has to be given to the boy to present his story. Without that, you cannot just a complaint has come in, it's okay, I'm transferring. That's violation of the due procedure. So due procedure has still to be followed. And as we say in the criminal courts, etc., we say that the prima facie case has been made out or not. There are more people than this woman also suggesting, or somebody else is also saying, yes, we have seen this happening. So something more has to be. But as a starting point, we do say that we believe her, but we cannot condemn without hearing him. And therefore the committee also, the constitution of the committee is also such that there will be a male representative, there will be a female representative from the students, there will be staff representative, there will be a non-teaching staff representative, so that you get a balanced view of it. Of course, there will be an independent a member also outside the institution. So the constitution of the ICC also has been created to ensure that fair hearing is provided to both the parties. And we cannot start or no, we cannot continue to have an assumption about the guilt of somebody. There's a prima facie case, and then whether certain action is required. The action can certainly vary. We had a very, very big case of sexual harassment in Ramjas College. At that point of time, we were all very upset when the vice chancellor did not terminate their admission. And we all felt that, this is really bad that it has been proved that there was such a huge sexual harassment by these boys and no action has been taken. But the vice chancellor position at that point of time and till now has been that this will result into their future completely getting destroyed. So you have to take preventive measures without, and it is a possibility, sir. There will be situations where it's not possible, but one has to remember that, especially the university setup, that there are young people there and they have a whole life in front of them. So if it can be, their measures have to be taken. In the law faculty, we have had occasions where we have changed centers of the students concerned, sometimes the boy, sometimes the girl also, depending on what has been the preference of the girl. Sometimes we do find that it's all after talking to parties and determining what is the best. Different decisions have been taken. There has been no hard and fast rule. Of course, the law says that it is the accused person who should be shifted, or whatever relocation has to happen should happen to him, because he is the one who is doing the troublemaking. But it may sometimes be that actually it may be better for the woman to move from that situation. If there are too many people, because there might be, you can move the boy, but the boy may still have friends in that place. There are always this possibility. In all cases of bullying also, there are persons who will support the boy also, whatever that wrong the person might have been doing. So one has to look at the wholesomeness of the situation in determining action, but certainly action has to be there both at the sensitization level as well as at the disciplinary level. If nothing happens on either of the two levels, things will just become penal in their action, and not preventive. So penalty also results into prevention, but only after occurrence has happened. So therefore, I think two-pronged strategy, that you do sensitization also, as well as uh, do do take an action on that. Anybody who has a question? Ma'am, immediate suspension of the accused from the campus till further inquiry is conducted. Again, that will depend on how much prima facie evidence we have. Immediate suspension can happen only pending inquiry. There is a prima facie case made out, and the harassment is of such a nature, of such an acute nature, that his presence is persona non grata. That may happen, but may not be necessary in all cases. Then what about there is a provision in the legislation which says that the parties may compromise, though it will not be a financial compromise. What does that indicate to you? Why is that provision there? What is the implication of that provision?
Then the implication may be that not every time retributive justice might work, but sometimes restorative justice might also work. So the accused, the complainant, if she wants that the accused person publicly apologizes to her, that might also be maybe a better option than to just suspend that accused person.
Certainly. So it's not necessary that prevention can happen only by retribution. It can happen also by the accused person genuinely apologizing and then honoring that apology. So if the woman concerned, affected woman, the victim party does believe that's a genuine apology, they want to move on rather than pursuing the complaint that they have made. But what it has been seen as of recently in the newspaper, I think it did mention this, that one of the district judges' complaints cases, so the woman did not appear before the inquiry committee because they had already entered into a contract, into a compromise. And this Chief Justice said, people make these false complaints and then they don't even appear. So the compromise has been reached, the parties have settled. It cannot be seen as a false complaint to prevent his promotion. But that is how it was interpreted by the comment. This is how the comment came through, suggesting that he is saying if there is a compromise, which means it was a false complaint. But then not be sort of jumping onto those conclusions is a very, very seriously negative thing. One has to, and we saw in criminology, the latest thinking is about restorative justice, where we bring the two parties together. If the accused person agrees that he has committed the offense, committed the wrong, and the accused person is ready to apologize, ready to make amends. So it may not be necessary that no, he makes a public apology. It may be that he makes an apology to the victim herself. It may not be the demand of every victim to make the whole scenario in any case public. If it has happened in public, she may ask for a public apology. If it has happened in private, she may want a private apology. And merely because the person is saying apology does not mean that the other person has to certainly pardon that person. So it's all an individual category, but many times people do feel more satisfied through the process of restorative justice when a wrong has been done to them, when they understand what were the motivations, what the accused person has also gone through, and what are they dealing with themselves. So it is not only that in offending only the victims suffer, many a times the offenders also suffer. We had one student who wrote to me saying that, in the lift, he had put his arm around a girl's shoulder, not realizing that the girl would be offended by that. But the girl was offended. And the girl had not reported this to me, that she was offended, but he felt that she was offended. So he wrote a long apology letter saying that I had no intention of harassing her or anything. I just assume, but I think she's not exposed to this kind of physical behavior. So I apologize, and if she wants, if she considers it, I'm ready to apologize. I'll certainly keep away. So himself, on his own, as a preventive action, he had already done all that. And when I read that letter, the tenor of the letter certainly seemed that the boy was really suffering from this guilt that he has offended a girl without having any intention to offend her. So it may happen that sometimes misunderstanding happens. So one has to be really open to listening and then deciding that is it despite the woman's no, the boy is still continuing to harass her, stalking, etc. All have become offenses now. Previously, they were not part of the offenses, but today we do know voyeurism, stalking have become, in addition to sexual harassment, as an offense. So, any more thoughts?
Ma'am, I won't disclose any identities, but there have been so many experiences shared with me and my other female classmates where there's just persistent texting from this one person where it just seems like they don't understand what is offensive and what is not, and or what might make the other person uncomfortable. And I really don't know how to respond in those kind of situations because I want to also be like, this is wrong because, and this has offended me because, and also not in the way that also establish boundaries, but also not to discourage them from trying to improve and from feeling scared of ever interacting with a woman ever again.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very difficult to navigate those kind of situations, which happen pretty frequently with some of my classmates, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And what they did, they just blocked these people on WhatsApp or other social media platforms. And beyond that, what you do is you just you keep avoiding them. And so that's an experience I wanted to share, and also wanted to get some advice, what do we do in that situation?
I'll tell you once that a colleague of mine gave me a very close hug, and I felt that he was about to kiss. And I felt, no, I'm not comfortable with this. So I thought you are very modern. I said, yeah, I'm modern in some respects. In some respects, I'm not modern. I'm very traditional. So I think you have to be clearly articulating what are your ideas about it, what you're comfortable with, what you're not. But most of the time, we kind of ourselves shrink in ourselves. We're not able to express that, no, this is not what I'm comfortable with. So I'm okay with this, but I'm not comfortable with this. So I certainly think that we need to learn to articulate our feelings without being offended, because certainly there is a cultural gap. Women are taking a lot of strides in appearing modern, and the translation of that modernity is that, and this has happened many times to foreigners who come. because we assume that their society is very promiscuous and they're all open to from kissing, caressing to sexual intercourse with just anybody. A lot of Indian men will behave very differently with them, with the foreign women, than they would with the Indian women, because their understanding of the foreign woman is completely nil. Their assumptions are there about that. The same is happening to the modern Indian woman. She is sexually available, but it's not necessarily so. So you can be very liberal in your ideas, and you may have very different notions about what the sexual relationships are going to be. Everybody has to decide for themselves. So I think the ability to articulate and not to remain silent, but without no, because understanding it. But if this person still persists, then block them. If you do not, if you're not open to conversation, then sorry, I'm not. No, you are not my cup of tea. I'm not interacting. But I think in the first go, one has to give that benefit. I'm very good friends with this colleague I was referring to. So I got no problems, and he has got no problems. But I think ability to articulate is important. Ability to speak about is important without defaming, without imputing motives, because it may happen out of genuine affection and attraction to a person. But if you're not reciprocating in the same manner, you can just have to articulate and say it. A lot of people are good friends, despite some moments somebody has got attracted differently than their first person is. It does happen most of the time, many times, and that does not mean that your friendship has to stop if the other person understands your objection, respects your sentiments. If they don't, then there are thousands, millions others as well. I did say to my students here, I said, no, you have to speak out. If any sexual harassment is happening and you are not able to convince and convey to the other person, bring it to the notice of the authorities. Don't try to handle things when you are not able to handle. So I think without feeling ashamed, without feeling that I am the one responsible, without pointing fingers at yourself, you should be able to bring it to the notice of whoever is the right person. It may be your family, because many times girls from small towns, they are not able to talk about it at all, because if they mention, the information reaches their family, the family will say, come back home. No need to be in Delhi. Therefore, a lot of girls don't report it because they think that if they report it to the university, information will reach their parents and the parents will call them back. But the parents don't feel they're safe now. So that also kind of creates a vicious circle. So one has to really find support mechanism. Tell your friends, don't be alone. If you start using these mechanisms of not being ashamed, of not going introvert, of not demonizing the persons. So if there is a demon, certainly cut yourself out from that person. But not everybody who approaches you in an affectionate manner or in a manner which you do not like, first time, give them the benefit. If it continues, then it's their problem, not your problem. You can always make more friends, other friends. That's my understanding of the situation. You should certainly tell your other friends about, if somebody is still stalking you, still not understanding, you must tell it to the other that this is what's happening and this fellow is not understanding, because it may sometimes happen that you're not able to convince somebody else can tell them that it really means business.
Yeah.
And most of the abuses happen by isolating the abused person. Domestic violence continues. The whole technique of abuser is to isolate that person and destroy the confidence of that person. They will make everybody around who are connected with the abused party, whether they are friends, their family, they are sisters, brothers, whoever they are, they will make them so unwelcome in the marital home that the other people will stop coming. They don't want to be abused. So first they create an isolation that friends are not welcome, family not welcome, she is not permitted to go and meet people at will. So by isolating her, then you say, you do not know this, you do not know this, you have a complete fool. That is how they destroy the confidence of the person also. And that ultimately leads to complete subservience, making this other person completely subservient to them. But you're not meeting anybody, especially if you're not working outside the house. You've got no occasion to actually, go and find out what's happening in the people's life. So the cycle of the abuser's characteristic is that first they will isolate you and then they will destroy your confidence. So there's anybody like that in your life, run away. Run away miles from that person. So, okay, can we now talk about the conversation on reproductive rights? Ramesh, you still have some question?
No, ma'am. Thank you.
Anybody else who has a question on sexual harassment? Then we can, if not, otherwise we can move to the conversation on reproductive rights. Anybody who knows another person who has been sexually harassed? You don't have to name them, but do you know anybody who has been sexually harassed, or if you know somebody who has been alleged to have sexually harassed another?
I'm both.
Yes, you have already said that. I'm asking the others. So all others have, the good fortune of never having been harassed and never having known anybody who has harassed another. So silence is not going to convince me. Rangan, you know anyone who has been sexually harassed?
Yes, ma'am.
Either men or women. I'm not concerned that only women are harassed. I know that men are also harassed.
यस मैम, मैं जानता हूँ एक
Hmm.
लड़का और दो लड़कियों को जानता हूँ।
Hmm. तो जब उनका
उनको
सेक्सुअल हैरेसमेंट उन्होंने क्या किया? What did they do?
मैम कुछ नहीं किया था उन लोगों ने, कॉलेज छोड़ दिया था बाद में।
इंस्टीट्यूशन छोड़ दिया?
यस मैम, मतलब वो लोग
तो
उसमें काफी छोटे थे, उसमें मैं भी बहुत छोटा था। लड़का हमारा सीनियर था कॉलेज का, उस शायद 8वीं में था लड़का और हम 5वीं में थे, तब की बात है। और उसको एक लेडी टीचर ने किया था। ऐसी दो लड़कियां हैं, मतलब एक लड़की थी तो उसको तो रेप हुआ था, फिर बाद में उसकी शादी हो गई, फिर उसको फिर तलाक हो गया। तो एक तरीके से वो भी उसके साथ गलत है हुआ। और एक लड़की, वो भी माइनर लड़की थी, उसके साथ एक टीचर ने मतलब हाथ हाथ रखा था, तो वो भी बाद में इस लड़के ने भी कॉलेज छोड़ा था, उस लड़की ने भी कॉलेज छोड़ा था।
लड़के ने क्यों छोड़ा?
क्योंकि उसका फिर मन नहीं लगता था कॉलेज में ना, बात वो फंस गई थी।
अच्छा, वो लड़की को लड़की ने पहले छोड़ दिया?
नहीं मैम,
हम्म
मैम एक टीचर ने किया था तो टीचर को तो निकाला गया था, बाद में मालूम चला था, एक टीचर ने दूसरे को बताया, दूसरे ने तीसरे को बताया, तो फिर बात लड़के ने किसी को बोला ही नहीं था कि मेरे साथ ये हुआ है। टीचर ने ही आपस में बात की, तो फिर पेरेंट मीटिंग में बात उठ गई, किसी टीचर ने उठा दिया, तो फिर बात करी, फिर उस टीचर को निकाला गया था। वैसा लड़के ने तो अपने आप कॉलेज छोड़ दिया। तो
No,
ऐसा
this
ही
whole
होता है मैडम,
introvert
अब
thing
होता
that
ही
no,
है
there's something
नॉर्मली
wrong with
मैडम।
me is a very, very major syndrome for harassment victims, whether it is sexual harassment or it is sexual abuse, it is sexual violence. A lot of people think that I am to blame and I am not right now. So that's very, very difficult. And that's why it's very important to talk to others and get reinforcement. There's nothing wrong with you. It is the harasser who is in the wrong, and you are just fine. We have to move on, learn to do that, and actually empathize with them, hold their hand so that they are encouraged and feel normal in their lives. Okay, let's talk about reproductive rights. What do we understand by this word, by this phrase, reproductive rights?
Ma'am, choice of procreation.
Choice of procreation is one aspect of it. Reproductive health includes what? Whether you have a right to reproductive health.
Ma'am, I think it also includes uses of contraceptives also, because
Mhm.
even sexually transmitted diseases should also be there in this category.
Mhm. What else? Whether reproductive rights are an issue in case of women or they are an issue in case of men also. Why is this not reproductive rights? Why is it at all an issue to be talked about in gender justice course?
It's to do with the woman's body, the person who has the uterus, and that body often involves a lot of other politics that comes with it. That whether she can be allowed to make that choice or not often comes up, and that choice is often the debate occurs because of power differentials which exist because of her gender. So hence it becomes relevant to our course to navigate the biology and the sociological aspects of that biology of having a uterus and then the pregnancy that comes with it and the choice to abort the fetus or not.
So there are lots of things involved here. One is the biology of human beings, and for production of children, you require cooperation of the male and a female. And the body of the female is actually responsible for the gestation and giving childbirth. So certainly there are a lot more consequences to the woman's body in cases of reproduction of human race than it is to the male body. But the fact that there's no effect on the male body of the childbirth, does it mean they should have no rights? Whether, and then whole thing, the question, whether reproduction is a right or whether it is a human right. We say that all living creatures have the inherent designing of reproducing itself. To take at any living organism, any seed has inbuilt capacity to make many more trees. So every tree would have the seeds, which will, or they will have other system, but reproduction in the nature is a very natural phenomenon. So it's a natural phenomena. Then whether the reproduction, right to reproduce, has to be ensured to everyone, whatever it needs to be done. So without people being, if it's not a healthy seed, if it's not a healthy woman, it's not a healthy man, certainly reproduction will not occur. So health, just pure simple health, is a first requirement for people to be able to reproduce. So do you remember your data on anemia? Women are more anemic than men are. And it is the women who have to produce babies also, despite this fact. So which means that the risk to the woman is much higher because of anemia and because of childbirth. Do we have any sense of what is the maternal mortality rate, MMR? Out of 100,000 live births, how many mothers die? I've given you that fact sheet. You can have a look at that. So we have put a target. There is a, okay, let's look at those facts actually. Fact sheet, present. In this one, world over, there has been, okay, let me show you that also. I don't think I'll be able to show, but let me go there. At the world level, every day in 2017, approximately 110 women died from preventable causes related to pregnancy and childbirth. Between 2000 to 2017, the maternal mortality ratio, number of maternal deaths dropped worldwide by about 38% of all maternal deaths occur in low and lower middle income countries. Young adolescents, that is aged from 10 to 14, face a higher risk of complications and death as a result of pregnancy than other women. Skilled care before, during, and after childbirth can save the lives of women and newborn. This is our international trends. Coming to the Indian scenario, we made a very fast decline. In 1990s, we had 556 women dying during childbirth per 100,000. So approximately 1.38 lakh women were dying every year on account of pregnancy, complications of pregnancy and childbirth. Global MMR at that time was 385. But there has been accelerated decline, and in 2011 and 13, it has come to 167. The target we had put under the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal, was the target for 2015 was 139. So even in we did not reach that target, but now we do expect that we will be coming to all these figures are there. An average annual decline is 4.6 for us in the last 25 years. And we are in the countries of, we are making progress in this one. So this chart here does give you the decline from 398 to 97 to 167 in the 2011 to 13 period. Now these are the states. Look at, as I said, this is the economically in countries level. So in our case, when you look at the states, Assam has the highest MMR, followed by Uttar Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Rajasthan. Annual decline has been from 2010 to 13 of 6.2. The Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Haryana, Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Punjab, Gujarat have registered equal or higher decline as compared to the national decline of 6.2. So either that or more, which have achieved the MMR of 100, it is Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, and Andhra Pradesh. The states of Gujarat, Haryana, Karnataka, and West Bengal have also reached the target kept for MDG 5. Additional efforts are still required. The states of Assam, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, which have got higher MMR as compared to the national level. When you look at these states, Maharashtra is not a poor state, but we still have that a high rate of their mortality rate is higher, equal or higher than the national particular. They're declining, but they're still higher than the national rate. So the latest one is that we will have 70 deaths MMR per 100,000 live births by 2030. 2017, the target was MMR by 2020. We haven't reached that target yet. Then the fact that if there is an institutional delivery, it will be lesser mortality. We do know that we have been making progress, but still we still do not have 100% institutional deliveries. The key strategies for accelerating pace of decline, they are there, and as we look at that. What we also want to ask ourselves is the capacity, these are all the measures, you can have a look at them. Is our state-wise chart. We have many schemes also. One is this Janani Suraksha Yojana here. It is a government paper. So remember that certainly government will project itself with whatever is best. And even in the best, we know that there are gaps there. The scheme focuses on this. This weekend you can have a look at later on. So you want to come back to when you look at this data, and with the many women giving birth to children at home, the issue of medical care at the time of delivery, and most of the time they would be the women who had not even seen a doctor during pregnancy. So pre-neonatal and postnatal care, medical care has not been provided for. That certainly is an aspect of it. But first of all, they have to be healthy in order to have a safe conception and give birth safely to the children. Therefore, when we were looking at the health data, and we do know that there is a higher mortality rate among women, female children, because they are taken to the hospital only when they are very severely ill. And many of them die because of that factor, that they did not get the support at the right time. Even though at the time of birth, the survival capacity of the female child is much more than that of the male child. So in the absence of that, so that's one kind of issue that we have, that women's bodies themselves are not healthy enough for them to bear children. The second one is the son preference and the ability to make a choice, because the first thing I think Amisha said that, but I'm not too sure, who said that the ability to choose reproduction. And we are still focused only on men and women at the time. For the time being, we'll come to the third as well. So how many women have the capacity to determine whether to conceive? And you did say about the use of contraceptives. On whom is the burden, primary burden of family planning? So you have many mechanisms for family planning, including condoms and T-sections and operations of the two sides of the either men or women. Who bears the burden of contraception? Whether it is equally shared by men and women, men use as many condoms as women get T-sections, or they go through infertility, what do you call that, Nasbandi, what is that called? Operations for the men and the women?
Tubectomy and vasectomy.
Yeah, so how many men go through that operation and how many women go through that operation? There's a very, very clear gendered ratio there. Majority of the contraception activities burden, whether it is pill, whether it is whatever the contraceptive measures the couples are using, the responsibility is put on the woman to do that. Men do not want to go for tubectomy, because they think that they will lose their virility. While there is no connection between the two, that the men do not become impotent by the tubectomy, but it is a myth among the men that they will not be able to have sex if they went through the operation, and therefore they do not go through it. It is the women who are going through. So whenever they are taking pills, when they are getting through operations, so all the complications and side effects of that are borne by women. So it is all about, so it is the women who suffer a lot more, even in cases of prevention. And many a times, even the prostitutes will say that men do not want to have sex with a condom on. So the safety of the woman against STD, whether they are wives or whether they are just women or whether they are the sex workers, any category of women are not safe because from STDs because of this factor, and that does affect their health as well. When it comes to making choices about children, who decides in the family? Whether the law permits the woman to make a decision of aborting a child. And I'm talking about married women. So certainly when we're talking about abortion will be as much part of reproductive rights as will be the conception. So when we're talking about reproductive rights, whether there is any data which suggests that women then, because it is their body which will get affected by whatever happens or doesn't happen, so therefore they should have the absolute right to decide whether to have children or not, when to have children, how many to have. Do they have that capacity, that power? Because we said initially, we said status, there are indicators of status. And one of these status indicators, what? How much control you have over your own body. So in case of rape, we have seen marital rape is not an offense. As a starting point, so they lose their contract, and we do know that sexual intercourse, whether violent or otherwise, can lead to pregnancy. And if we do not give a wife the right to even resist a sexual intercourse, we really expect that the woman will be able to exercise their rights to decide whether to have and when to have and how many children to have. The majority of the women do not have that right, do not have that control over their body in terms of reproduction of children. So does the IPC recognize that reality? What are the sections in IPC we deal with pregnancy and abortion? We only have abortion, we do not have provision on pregnancy. So when you look at IPC, sections from 312 onward, causing miscarriage. Explanation to section 312 says, a woman who causes herself to miscarry is within the meaning of the section. And the section says, whoever voluntarily causes a woman with child to miscarry, and this miscarriage is not caused in good faith for the purposes of saving the life of the woman, is punishable with imprisonment extending to 3 years with fine with or both. If the woman is quick with child, which means that the process of birth has already begun, they shall be punished with imprisonment, either description of up to 7 years, and also fine. So if a woman herself also does this, aborts at any point of time, either during conception, during pregnancy, unless it is done to save the woman. So the film story which says, no, we are at a critical stage, we have to save, we can save only one, either the child or the woman or the mother. So the law says at that point of time, you can abort the child, but not in any other circumstance. So it has to be done in good faith. That was the only circumstance in IPC which was permitted, and the woman herself is. So with today we have this whole thing about amniocentesis, the sex determination test. If the woman comes to know that she already has got 2 daughters, there's been pressure to have a son. She gets to know that she has a 3rd female fetus and she wants an abortion. Can she go for it? Does the law permit that? Law certainly doesn't permit that. But then when she is forced, and it may be an indirect pressure to have a son, or it may be a direct pressure to abort. She aborts. She is equally liable. So as a wife, we saw in IPC, she was not seen as an equal partner, having the capacity to make decisions about her sexuality. But when it comes to motherhood, we give her complete capacity to decide whether to be a mother or not to be a mother. Absolute responsibility on her if she decides to abort a fetus. And we believe that this decision she can take on her own. She could not take a decision on her own to have sex outside marriage or not. Presumption of the law was she is always seduced. She does not know what she's doing. But in case of motherhood, in case of pregnancy, law assumes that she has got full capacity. So our construction of women as mothers is the same. She will be fierce to protect her children. She will go to any extent to protect her children. And therefore, she has the capacity to do anything. So if she does anything to harm the child, she will be fully responsible. At that point of time, in this scenario, we are not taking cognizance of what may be the constraint on the woman because of which the decision apparently she has agreed to is actually not her decision. It has been forced by the family. So 313 certainly talks about miscarriage without the consent. So 312 is in that sense very interesting. And we do know that the provisions of this legislation have been overridden by MTPA, Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act. So let's look at some of the provisions in that legislation. So look at the opening part. This is an act to provide for the termination of certain pregnancies by registered medical practitioners and for matters connected therewith or incidental thereto. So it is not about granting a right to women to terminate their pregnancy, but termination in certain circumstances. So it only says extend to now everywhere it extends. Section 3. When pregnancy may be terminated by registered medical practitioner. An opening point is notwithstanding anything in IPC. A medical practitioner shall not be guilty of the offense under that code or under any other law if the pregnancy is terminated by him in accordance with the MTPA. And the circumstances we know are 12 weeks with the opinion of one doctor, and when it is beyond 12 weeks but not more than 20 weeks, then 2 registered medical practitioners can give that. And the opinion has to be not only that it is safe, but they have to also give the opinion that the pregnancy would involve a risk to the life of the pregnant woman or grave injury to her physical or mental health. So it is not that the women have been granted a right to terminate their pregnancy by the FTPA. It is only enabling in that circumstance. One circumstance is similar to one what we have in IPC. But there also that if the woman's life was at stake, one could have aborted even under the IPC. The addition is that it is not only limited to life of the pregnant woman, but includes grave injury to her physical or mental health. So what does this mental health refers to? So the fact that the family will be really saying, "Tisre beti kar di paida," and she will be completely taunted, whether that will be considered as mental health issue or not. Open for discussion, but we do know that the judges are never going to buy that argument. And so also because of the explanations attached to this one. So the second one is, there is substantial risk that if the child were born, it would suffer from such physical or mental abnormalities to be seriously handicapped. Now, what do we understand by the second clause? This is a new addition, which wasn't there in IPC. So what does this mean? Severe abnormality. What are the standards to determine that? And the person with disability has been questioning this very much. They are saying that the fact that you are permitting a person with disability, severe or otherwise, to abort, then you are saying these people do not have a right to be born. So the whole outing of the that they are others, they are not normal, So if somebody who is alive becomes disabled, they're also not seen as having respect. They're also not respected because they're not supposed to be here. Only persons with able bodies should be permitted to be born. That is the message which the second part gives. And certainly, the doctors might tell, "Oh, this boy or this child does not have a fully developed arm." Parents will not go into the question of saying what is the nature of disability unless you're really pro-life and you do not want any abortion under any circumstance. Parents will not question the medical opinion. The medical will say, no, the child is abnormal, you go for abortion, without having any assessment about what is the nature of disability. Even though the section is using, what were the words used by the section? It says seriously physical or mental abnormalities to be seriously handicapped. They have always added, this has been the studies there, that the classification is not there as to what amounts to serious abnormality. And therefore, doctors, they have normalized any disability as the one which requires abortion. And many parents do not ask this question, what is the nature of disability? Then the other question is also, because one is the criticism from the perspective of the disability activists, which are saying that no, this provision is, and this has never been questioned also, accepting by the disability activists. People say that no, we abnormal hai to usko to phir kaise? No, why should we allow that child to be born? Because the child will also suffer. The argument is not that I will also suffer, I will have to get special care for the child who is mentally or physically handicapped. That the child will also suffer mentally and physically. Therefore, why allow that child to be born? To extend that argument to the living people, it becomes very, very nasty. And one does not know what to do with them then when people become disabled after being born. And actually, people born with disability do not consider their disability as a disability because they have not seen any other aspect of their life. For them, that is normal. It is we who have that limb or that ability. We think that they are disabled, but a person who since birth has not experienced any other ability than what they have, from their perspective, it is not a disability. This is what is normal for them. So a classification also as to what constitutes disability is a major concern. And I think I've shared this, that I was talking to a person who has been on a wheelchair all his life. And when I said something about normal, he said, this is my normal. I've never stood my own feet. So for me, I've suffered disability many times with fractures and all. So I know what it is to be able to walk on your feet and what it is not to be able to walk on your feet, but with the help of the crutches. So I know what is disability from my perspective because I have another occasion when I'm not dependent on crutches. But a person who has always lived with crutches or a wheelchair, that's what their life is about, and they do not think that they're not worth living. Many of them, especially the ones who have become aware that these disabilities, the concept is all created. There's nothing normal about saying that the persons with disability are not normal human beings. So our categorization of what's normal, etc., has been questioned in that provision. But certainly when it comes to the section itself, that is the big question that we have permitted two situations. So what will constitute mental health? Explanation 1 says where any pregnancy is alleged by the pregnant woman to have been caused by rape, the anguish caused by such pregnancy shall be presumed to constitute a grave injury to the mental health of the pregnant woman. So whether this explanation is the only circumstance of a grave mental health issue, or can there be more? So the fact that you have already some daughters and everybody is pressing for a son and you abort, and if you do not abort, then it is going to cause grave mental injury to her mental health. We have not come across cases being argued on that ground. But we have had cases where the Sony, we know Sony is one example, where they're saying we should have a right to determine the nature of our family. If I want to have children, one boy and one girl, I should be able to decide that, because not having that will cause us mental anguish. So therefore, certainly there is this argument based on the mental health aspect. The judges have not accepted that. They said you want to have children, and it is a child you want to have. You cannot, in the name of reproductive rights, cannot say, I have a right to have a son, I have a right to have a daughter. The only thing we are granting from your body is that you have a right to have a child. Beyond that, we're not granting you the choice of having a male or a female child. But Sony does raise that question, that I should be able to determine it's intruding into my right of privacy. What happens in my family, whether I'm having sons or daughters, I should be able to determine. And certainly in the Western world, there is no such prohibition. There are these parties held to find out what is to kind of reveal the sex of the child. They've got all kinds of videos are there on YouTube, and they are having this blue and red and to determine, okay, where is what sex is the child. So the very innovative strategy, because they do not have the issue of son preference. In South Asia, we have the issue of son preference. In that category, can we say that the reproductive rights include the right to have a male or a female? We'll come to that when we come to PCPAPT Act legislation also. But just as a starting point, that on the legislation when it says mental health, how do you construe the mental health component? Today, we certainly know that we have not included that aspect within our understanding. So one is the rape scenario, where they say, yes, it will cause. The second one, where any pregnancy occurs as a result of failure of any device or method used by any married woman or her husband for the purpose of limiting the number of children, the anguish caused by such unwanted pregnancy may be presumed to constitute grave injury to the mental health of the pregnant woman. A big question on evidence. Can you prove in the court of law that you are actually using the contraceptive? So that is a provision which has been used by married couple when they're consensual to get abortions done. Whether they've used the device or not, they will say there was a failure, and we know that scientifically 15% is the failure rate of the devices, contraceptive devices. So despite the use of contraceptive devices, pregnancy may still occur. And if it happens in that scenario, the law says yes, then also you can abort, but also only within the time limit of 12 weeks and 20 weeks, not beyond that. Beyond that, whatever happens, whether it is rape pregnancy or whether it is contraceptive failure pregnancy, there is no relief a woman can ask for. And we know that there have been individual cases where the women have gone to the courts beyond 20 weeks, and the courts have, on individual cases, granted them the relief in the special circumstances of the case. But as a general rule, we do not have. So contraceptive failure is also of the married woman. So if an unmarried woman has unprotected sex, or no, not unprotected, or koi bhi safe nahi. So the unmarried woman had sex with protection, but due to failure, she becomes pregnant. Can she abort? Woman who had an unmarried woman who had consensual sex while using contraceptives becomes pregnant, can she seek abortion within 12 weeks of pregnancy?
Ma'am, I think there was a amendment last year, and this criteria of married women was changed. Now it can be any woman.
It is still proposed. No, I don't think it has been passed yet. It's still at the, because the the important point, whether we can check that again, whether the amendment which took place on removing that has already come into force or not. My sense is that it's still not. And it may come, their proposal is running yes on. The question is, why was it limited to married women? What is the value? Because what we are trying to understand is that what are the values underlying these provisions? So in case of IPC, even though we know it's a patriarchal family setup, we assumed equality of choice in women. In case of MTPA, the circumstances in which we are permitting abortion are, one is the health, the other is the rape, the third one is failure of contraceptive in case of married women. So why failure of contraceptive is a circumstance as a starting point to permit abortion? That had come because of the national policy population control. That, okay, people don't want to produce it, let it allow that to happen. But if that was only population control, then any woman should have been permitted. The fact that every woman has not been permitted, then what are we still reinforcing? Sex without marriage is not permissible. To do that, neither you're protected in rape law, nor are you protected under the pregnancy law as well. So we are again back to the moral sexual relationships. If you're being immoral, you become pregnant, that's your problem. Law will not help you with that. So that's the important point to learn about it. That why was it that only so at one level we are saying, oh, family control, and therefore we are saying use contraception, family control, population control. We are dealing with a huge issue of population control. Therefore, we will include this. But it is not so simple as that. If it was only population control, then every woman should have been enabled to abort, saying failure of contraceptive. But the fact that it was limited only to married women indicated that there was a morality issue again involved, not only population control. Thus, this law says that the married woman, because of failure of contraceptive, could abort without the consent of the husband? Or does she need the consent of the husband? We don't say anything about that. But the practice has been that married women must get a written permission from their husbands to abort. Because otherwise the husband will say, no, again, the practice was indicative of the rights of the husband over the wife. Even though the law did not ask for it. But they didn't want to deal with the husbands, the doctors. कि नहीं, husband की permission लेके आओ. It is her body. So even in those cases, there was no right given to the woman concerned in actual practice. It was just, certainly in any case, it is an enabling provision. There's no right. No woman can claim right to abortion. It is only an enabling category. But even in that enabling category, more restrictions have been created in the practice of abortion. The section further. Let's stop presenting. The section further says, subsection 3. In determining whether the continuance of a pregnancy will involve such risk of injury to the health as mentioned in subsection 2, account may be taken of the pregnant woman's actual or reasonable foreseeable environment. So I'm again back to 3 daughters, 4 daughters, and she goes and aborts the 5th one. Fourth one says, no pregnancy of a woman who has not attained the age of 18 years or who, having attained 18 years, is a lunatic, shall be terminated except with the consent in writing of her guardian. So we have got these two scenarios. Either she is child below 18 or is a lunatic. So what about children who are mentally retarded? They're not lunatic. A child who is mentally retarded, which means that she has the full developed body of a woman. She's capable of giving birth. And we have had cases where she's raped. Parents say, abort the child. The mentally retarded child says, no, I want to keep the child. How do you determine that question then?
And then she's not seen as someone who has agency to decide according to 4A and B.
Yeah, so it is okay, she doesn't have the capacity to look after the child because she is mentally immature. Her child is, her mind is like of the child. But when this other woman, I forget the name, I'll find that out. The woman went to the Supreme Court saying that my child, who is 28 years physically, has got the mental age of a 6 to 8-year-old child. She was raped. The prosecution should happen under POCSO and not under the IPC. The court said no. So there you're not saying the mental capacity of the child will determine what should be the law which applies. So whether it is the physical age of the person which would determine the capacity is to decide, or should it be the mental age? In this particular case in which this question did raise, the NGOs came into being, and then we will support the child to have to bring up the child. The abortion was not ordered. So somewhere the very tricky situations that when there is a mental health issue, whether it's of a lunacy also, when it's a lunatic, there might be people who are lunatic periodically. Lunatics are not necessarily lunatic all the life. So they get the attacks of lunacy. So there's a woman who gets attacks, whether she will be in the category where parents will determine whether she will have child or not. Even before pregnancy, there is this whole issue of menstruation of mentally retarded girls, part of reproductive cycle. So in one incident, the girls in the institution for mentally retarded girls, the institution directed hysterectomy so that they will not have, not hysterectomy, whatever the other shorter operation than that, because of which women do not have. So the other word, one was, and the other one?
Vasectomy for men.
So they had ordered hysterectomy of all these girls because managing them during menstruation was a hell. So again, there were divided opinion on that. One group saying that no, it's their human right not to have interference with their bodies. Just because you are mentally retarded, you cannot allow somebody else to take that fall for you. The parents are saying, yes, let's do away with the process that they will not have menstruation. The carers were saying, it's just impossible to look after these girls when they are menstruating. So what should prevail? And that would mean that these girls would never be able to have children. So should the women who are mentally retarded be not permitted to have children? Whether we will apply the same criteria, same standard for men having mental retardation, but physically they are completely capable of producing children. So if they are married and they produce children, and there are other family members who will look after their son's son, should women be treated differently because they menstruate, because they have to breastfeed, because they have to do so many things? Whether these responsibilities which the mothers have are the criteria, or whether the love and affection human beings feel for their offspring is the criteria. what should determine whether support can be provided to these people who are mentally retarded, and this we do in case of boys. In case of boys, we do not say don't marry them, do not allow them to have children. In case of girls, we bring up all that argument. Whether assume that mother should look after the baby, if she's not capable of, then issues. Boys are in any case, even the able boys are not required to look after children. So it doesn't matter. So we have very, very double standards in determining what is permissible for women and what is not permissible for women. It's not gender neutral. Even though the reproductive rights category seems like this is gender neutral, but we do know that there are a lot of gender angles to it. Returning to our legislation again. Say whether thereby provided in clause A, no pregnancy shall be terminated except with the consent of the pregnant woman. Nowhere it says consent of the pregnant woman's husband is required. Like we know that has been the trend. Section 3 and 4 do not apply when immediate action is required to save the life of the pregnant. In the opinion of the doctors, registered medical professionals. So this is what we have in terms of medical termination of pregnancy act. So what are the stop sharing? So what are the approaches we are finding here in terms of difference, in terms of sameness, patriarchy, and paternalism?
Patriarchal.
In case of IPC, what is the approach of the law?
Sameness.
Sameness, not recognizing the patriarchal structures which will affect the decision-making power of the woman. I think same responsibility for both men and women. In case of MTPA,
In the married woman part would be patriarchal.
that's patriarchy. What else? You find any paternalism in this?
And with respect to lunacy and
What are the other provisions reflecting patriarchy?
That ma'am, married woman can abort with the permission of his husband.
Yeah, even though the legislation doesn't say so. It only says her consent. So the practice is certainly patriarchal. What about the rape woman ability to abort? How do you view that?
would that qualify as paternalism?
To some extent, we want to protect you from all the burden.
And
But again, yeah,
foreseeable environment.
I can't hear you, Soumya.
Ma'am, that you have to take account the pregnant woman's actual or reasonable foreseeable environment.
Mm-hmm.
That could be.
To certain, it is not coming when the interpretation of mental injury is not coming from the perspective of difference, that a woman's experience of mental pressure and the consequences of that mental pressure on women is not the criteria. The mental injury is seen more from the perspective of failure of contraceptive, rape, injury to yourself, Shadi, that's an independent category. So in those cases also it is paternalism when he says injury to your life will save you. What would require a difference? What would difference approach require to change in this law? What kind of changes will be required to say it is promoting difference?
I'm a more absolute form of decision making for the woman, because
Yes,
pregnancy.
the human bodies are different and absolute. If your body is going to get affected, you should have absolute right to decide when to have, how many to have, not to have. If a woman decides not to have children at all, she's not a woman who cannot produce children. A married woman who decides not to have children at all, and the husband wants to have children. Should the husband be granted mental cruelty, divorce on ground of mental cruelty?
I think in actual courts it's considered mental cruelty, but it should not be, because that should be weighed
Look at the
against.
vice versa situation. The woman wants to have children. The man says, no, I will not have any children. Will it amount to mental cruelty to the woman?
I
Again, double
Yes,
standards.
should not.
Will she be able to take divorce from the husband who says, no, I don't want your children?
ma'am, I think court should allow it. Otherwise, what's the point? In one case, they are considering it as mental cruelty, and another point, they are not. So
Yeah,
it's
but that's what the double standards are all about. But in case of men, the argument will be he has to provide. If he doesn't have the money to provide, he's well within the rights to say no, no, no children. We have constantly double standards being applied for the same conduct when it is committed by a woman or whether it is when it is committed by a man. We do not view the conduct in a gender neutral manner because we do not live in a society which is gender neutral. It's a very gendered society, expected division of roles, expectations from different roles. And you have to fall in line if you want to be normal. If you are abnormal, you are causing the problem to the other. And with this whole role of the husbands and the men being the providers, they also get the right to have how many children? The woman wants to have 12 children. He wants to have only one. In that one, the argument will come in a national population control policy. So the thing goes in favor of the men. If the man says, no, I want to have more. Today, so of course, we have put a block on that saying more than 2 children, you lose out on lots of opportunities of political participation. You lose out on some benefits of your job as well. But they lose out on the jobs or whatever options are there. But woman ends up having more strain on their body. So the consequences of having more than the prescribed norms are much worse on the woman than it is on the men. But we still do not recognize the rights in the woman to determine how many children to have and when to have such children. We also have this whole medical thing that woman's body clock is ticking. Today, we do know that some medical reports have shown that the body clock of men also tick, and children produced by men above the age of 40 end up being quite a many, having a lot of physical issues, physical mental issues. But that is still not part of the folklore. That's a new scientist discovery because the manner in which science has also determined, when they determine, that suppose there's a couple and they're not able to have children, the first thing everybody will say is for the woman to go for medical checkup. They will not say both of you come for medical checkup. Assumption is the problem will be in the woman. The man is capable of having sexual intercourse. There's no problem with the sperm. So all the investigation, all the medication will start with the woman, and she suffers the consequences of all those medication. It may turn out that later it's the man who was infertile. But the medical science has also created this myth that the problem is in the woman. As we know that the problem of producing sons and daughters is with the men, not with the women. But the blame of producing daughters is on the woman. So somewhere constantly the manner in which the social norms and social knowledge has been created is very gendered. So the difference, yes, Soumya?
Ma'am, even with respect to contraceptive pills like birth pills, that has severe side effects on the woman's mental health. Like it can also lead to suicidal tendencies, etc. But I was reading that how medical science does not invest a lot to come up with a better formula, which does away with this kind of side effect. And somebody was raising a point where erectile dysfunction was a huge problem, and people came up with Viagra, and like multiple, like billions of dollars was invested in this kind of medical science. But when it is something such as like suicidal tendency and the mental health and like life of a woman and her physical health, nothing was like the priority is very much low versus like something like erectile dysfunction when it comes to men.
True. I mean, there's also this whole thing about where the male body is also taking is a very, very recent medical reports that male body ticks also has never been recognized as a situation. So women are put under a lot of pressure to produce children before the age of 30. It is first child before the age of 30, where the body clock is clicking, and that is the time when you are struggling with your career. So men can have their first child post 40 by the time they've already reached the top positions or closer to the top position. Women have to leave their jobs in between because their body clock. So there are lots of myths being created by all the disciplines around women's reproductive uh, functioning. And we certainly need to identify that most of it is coming from the patriarchal values, from the paternalism of the situation, exceptionally sameness also, which disadvantages her rather than advantages her. And difference is not still on the card. The demand for pregnancy rights in the US was based on difference. They were not, because they could not have asked for sameness in that one. And they were claiming it as a matter of right that I should be able to decide when to have pregnancy, when to terminate pregnancy. Absolute right without the interference of the man. So they were making it as a claim, but in India, we still are not talking about rights at all. But the enabling provisions are also still very, very patriarchal in their nature and in conception. Enforcement certainly is completely patriarchal. I'm going to stop now, unless you have some questions for today. And we meet tomorrow to continue looking at PCP and DT and the cases we have on this subject, as well as the pregnancy legislation. Any observations, questions, comments, thoughts? So you can mark your attendance and we can close for the day.